One of the main comics that I read as a kid that turned me into the comic fan that I am today is the UNCANNY X-Men, specifically from the 80s and 90s. Nothing topped that Chris Claremont run for me, especially since he's worked with some rock star artists like Dave Cockrum, Paul Smith, John Romita Jr., Mark Silvestri, and Jim Lee, to name a few. As I've gotten older, I've always tried to find a way back into the X books with varying degrees of success. I think a lot has to do with my expectations are pretty high, and I'm always comparing it, probably a lot to do with the nostalgia of when I first discovered comics. Recently, Marvel has relaunched their X books with their From the Ashes campaign. One of the books in that line is the book that started it all for me, UNCANNY X-Men. This one's written by Gail Simone with David Marquez on art. So naturally, I had to give it a try, and I thought this would be a great candidate to go through for a new episode of my Closer Look series. Okay, here we go. UNCANNY X-Men by Gail Simone and art by David Marquez. This is the variant cover for this first issue, the Disco Dazzler variant, and I had mentioned this in my Wednesday Comics Live where I first showed this book. I'm not a big fan of this cover. No offense to the artist, but it just had nothing to do with the story. It's almost like a gimmick, and that's not the first impression you want to get when you are starting a new series. So even though it's a good drawing, it does feel Adam Hughes-ish to me. It didn't do anything to attract me to pick up the book, but this was the only one I could find at the time. I would have picked up the original cover A, but sometimes you get what you get. One of my apprehensions about jumping into a relaunch of the X books was there's a huge gap in what I've read and how I've kept up with what's going on. So that's something that I think is a tricky thing for editors, writers, and artists to a certain extent, of how do you bring back in an audience who might know a lot of history of an X book? How do you not bore them with having to rehash all this stuff? And also for new readers, how do you introduce them to a character, a story, a world that might have years and years of backstory? How do you not turn them off to feeling like it's too much to get into this series? So that was a big question for me. Already from the get-go in this panel, we see a very familiar image to the X world, which is Xavier's School for the Gifted Youngsters. This is something we've seen used many a times in all the X books. And so it's a very familiar scene, and I'm like, oh yeah, I recognize that. But yet they show us some graffiti here where it feels like the school either is abandoned or hasn't been lived in. It's a nice touch here where there's graffiti. If there was an active school, that graffiti wouldn't be there. But because it's there, you feel like, oh, some time's passed, something's happened. Here's the first introduction to a character. I don't know if she's new to these books or if she has been introduced in the past, but her name is Dr. Ellis. And immediately in her interaction with this military guy, Captain Ezra, you get a sense that her character is not here to play any games. She's pretty cutthroat, and how she talks to him is definitely as a superior. She's not beating around the bush of what she wants to do. She talks about eliminating every aspect of the mutants and what has been there before. Pretty extreme language, but it sets that tone that the stakes are very high. This is somebody who doesn't like mutants, and she is not here to play. I love these scenes. Feels empty. The school feels empty, but they're familiar. So for somebody who, like myself, who is familiar with the X books, these are scenes that we've seen before. This is a great little touch here of a Lockheed stuffed animal, an old X-Men / New Mutants costume, all these kind of relics of the past, the quietness of it. It's a great shot. Here's another familiar scene of Cerebro. We've seen it both in the comics and in the movies. of this huge dome, and it feels really empty here with the colors. It's great touch. And then the intro ends on her saying there's their first prisoner. You get the sense like, okay, this is a mutant. Here she is, like, kind of proud that they've captured her. If there's this many military soldiers around it, this mutant must be powerful or can get out. There's all these kind of bindings and restraints. So it leaves in your mind like, okay, who is this mutant? Do I know who this mutant is? And what is she going to do to them? This is going to be serious. Then we go to the credits, which is cool. It's a great way to kind of intro into the book. Here they introduce the four main characters that we will be seeing. And these are four characters who are familiar, right? Rogue, Gambit, Wolverine, Nightcrawler. They look familiar. They are familiar. And they're in familiar costumes, or they look, how you would expect them to. So it's great. It's a great intro. We're in Mexico City here with Logan, and he's visiting somebody in the hospital. And just the dialogue between them is a classic Wolverine setup. Wolverine is usually thrown into some remote location in the past. He's spent some time there, so he's built up relationships with people there. We don't know who this guy is, really, or at least I don't. But he's on his deathbed, and you see Wolverine kind of comforting him, visiting him. This is a cool device where they repeat the framing, and this is kind of how my crazy brain works. When I see repeat panels, I instantly start looking at like, oh, is this just a copy and paste of the artwork? Or was it a redraw, even though it's the same panel? And it is a copy and paste of the artwork with an addition of like this hat. I kind of wish that David Marquez would have redrawn this or altered it a little bit so it didn't feel like an exact copy. Because when I see that, I see copy paste, digital art. That's just me. I kind of like to see variances in that, but it's okay. It's very effective as far as telling us like, oh, there's a flashback moment and we're going inside of Logan's head. And here we are with Rogue and Gambit. Classic costumes. It's a great image of Rogue carrying Gambit and them kind of having this reunion. This is classic Logan. Leather jacket, cowboy hat, motorcycle. This is Logan's head in the foreground. And I initially missed it. I thought it was like rocks because of the coloring. I wish that Logan's head was tilted a little bit more up so we get the sense of he's looking up in the sky as Rogue is coming down. So yeah, I really missed that in this moment here. And I know that was the intention, but it feels like Logan's looking over here and they're landing up here. So there's a little bit of a disconnect in the storytelling there. And then they introduce this dragon, this like South American mythological dragon sitting on top of this temple, which is a cool image. You would think that there would be a bigger response to it as far as the world around, but I guess it's just, a dragon sitting on top of a pyramid. I guess that's normal, but that's okay. I mean, it's cool. It's a cool image. It's cool that it like reflects the culture, the South American culture, Teotihuacan culture. And so they kind of set it up here. They're talking about what the dragon is. She makes a reference to Lockheed, which is great. Lockheed is such a well-known dragon in the X-Men world. So it's kind of a nice throwback. And Lockheed was the stuffed animal in here. So just a nice little throwback there from the dialogue. One of the setups in this moment, in this situation, is right here where they say, that ain't the eye we should be worried about. That's Rogue talking about this dragon. So it gives you the sense that, oh, there's another eye. It's not just about the sleeping eyes, but there's another eye. However, in this panel, I got confused because this looks like to me, and I think it is, the regular eyeballs that they're talking about opening. So the dragon is becoming aware that they're standing right there. But for her to say that ain't the eye we should be worried about is telling us story-wise that there's another eye, a third eye that we should be worried about, which indeed is what she is talking about. But why would you show the eyes that they are worried about and say that ain't the eye that we are worried about on the same panel? So there's a disconnect in storytelling there, at least for me. I feel like we should have seen the eye that they should be worried about, not the eyes they are talking about. That's a lot of talking about eyes. This is great image of the dragon waking up. Very frightening, great angle, awesome. It's a great image. One of the things that starts happening during this action sequence that takes the place over several of these pages is I do get lost a little bit of the action. And the action is a very difficult thing to stage in comics because in most action sequences, things are happening very fast. There's a lot of dynamic movement happening. As the artist, you're trying to make sure that the reader is tracking where location is, where people are in reference to other things, to the action, how they're moving around in the space. And I did get lost quite a few times in this whole action sequence. And I'll go into some of the specifics. They set up, yes, great, dramatic, dragon's huge, the scale, awesome. We get a reverse shot where we still get some of the scale because of the shadow covering the characters in this panel. So that's great. But here it's like, what happens? Did the dragon just shoot out fire from his mouth? Did the dragon explode? Did somebody drop a grenade? Like, what's happening here? So there's a huge explosion, but we don't get a sense, is it coming from the dragon's mouth or what? So that was a little confusing. There's some fire going on behind Rogue as she like takes off into the sky. Going back to the original dialogue that Rogue brought up of like, this ain't the eye we should be worried about. Here is the very first time that we see that third eye in this comic. I feel like there should have been way more emphasis and call out to this being on the dragon's chest instead of kind of small in frame right after a huge explosion happens and the dragon himself is in silhouette. So you got to read like, oh, is that the dragon? Where is this on his body? And this eye is seeing who the characters are based on the green and saying, yes, I see who you are. And he kind of calls them out, but it's just so small in frame here. So I feel like since the eye, the third eye, is such an important part of the plot, it should have been emphasized, establishing it where it was a lot earlier and in a lot bigger way than they did here. There's dialogue between Rogue and the dragon. Very cool shots here. That's a great shot. Silhouette. Awesome. Focusing, I guess, on the eye because of the green. He starts fighting Rogue, slapping her around. Rogue is regrouping here. The dragon's coming in for another attack. I kind of wish this punch felt like I didn't know what she was punching, where she was punching. It's a little bit less dynamic, in my opinion, that she's punching an uppercut as opposed to punching at us or punching towards us, especially because we can't see what she is punching. So I wasn't sure. It's like, well, he's coming at you head first here, and then you're punching his neck or you're uppercutting his tail. Like, again, I couldn't understand how we got from here to here. And then he crashes right here. There's Gambit kind of flying in a tiny silhouette. Here's, I'm assuming, Wolverine, and then a small call out to the third eye here. So it's a lot of information that you are cramming into this tiny panel. Yes, that's a cool drawing of Rogue, but I feel like didn't quite totally work storytelling here for me. Then we have a shot of Wolverine jumping up really high into the sky because how do we know that? Well, he's looking down. It's kind of an upshot. It's cool. It's kind of tiny in the corner, and you're trying to do both a cool Wolverine action shot and a cool Rogue action shot, both on the same page, and then you reduce the space of everything else, which has a lot of information, into this panel. So I wasn't sure I really liked those choices. There's a lot of dead space up here. I feel like you could have just scaled this image up more to make it more dynamic. This is a cool shot that people want to see of Wolverine, but it's shrunk here and we give a lot of space for speed lines up here. I don't know. Then in this shot, I have no idea what Wolverine is stabbing at right here. It's really tight and we see pieces, and we're assuming he landed on the dragon somewhere, and we see pieces, so I have no idea what's happening. I'm assuming from this panel that he carved a hole into the dragon, and we're starting to see that third eye more, But then how did we see the eye here? What is it glowing out? Is it a window? Like, why did he have to dig so deep? So all those things are not set up. So whether I'm asking too many questions or I'm not reading it properly, but there is confusion for me as a reader that why is this eye so deep into the dragon? And then a huge explosion. So it feels like it's just a tiny hole that he's able to cut with his hands, but then this massive explosion coming out of it. So again, disconnect. What's going on here? Is this from the dragon? Is this a volcano? What is this? Gambit's joining in, Rogue's flying. Beautiful drawings. Again, nothing against Marquez's drawings and renderings. It's just the storytelling moments that he picks. The dragon is flying towards Rogue and Wolverine, and we go to a reverse shot, and all of a sudden, based on the dialogue, we see that Wolverine is stabbing one eyeball and Rogue is punching another eyeball here. It's a little confusing, or a lot confusing, because the way that the blood, I'm assuming the eye blood is rendered here, is very similar to the feathers around the neck. The coloring is very close to the feathers in the neck. And so I missed it the first time. I didn't understand that they were hurting his regular eyes here. I was just looking at this cool mouth drawing, and I totally missed what was happening here other than the sound effects. I didn't get that they're blinding him at this moment. I feel like they could have framed this a little bit farther down. They could have emphasized it more. They could have scaled up. They could have showed it in a number of different ways of how Wolverine and Rogue were attacking this monster's eyes. It's such an important story point that I feel like it needed more clarity. Here's a cool Gambit moment where he holds up his cards. So you're like, okay, cool. Gambit is going to throw his cards like he normally does. Oh, but wait, now the dragon's talking about how he's blinded. And then Gambit's not here. So we get a close-up moment here. We feel we're getting ready for Gambit to do something. He's not here, so we don't know what he's doing. Then we get this very abstract shot of him throwing his cards, and there's no payoff. Like, where did those cards go? What happened? What did they do? Did they do anything? And we never see what happened. So it's kind of a cool shot. It's a shot you would expect from Gambit, but there was no payoff to that. So a lot of confusion there. The dragon is spoken about in Revelations, in the book of Revelations in the Bible, which is kind of a classic Chris Claremont thing to integrate like religion into his writing. So that's kind of cool. It gives you this sense that this dragon's been here for a while. And then all of a sudden, Gambit is holding the third eye, the one that was buried in his chest. But how did that happen? Was that because of the cards? No clue. Really weird. Came out of nowhere. Amazing drawing of Gambit holding the eye, having his cards ready to blow it up. That's cool. That's a very cool, like, threatening moment. But I have no idea where it came from, how he ended up here. So, more confusion. Then the dragon kind of gives up and he's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, you got me. We see a little bit of his torn chest here, and they have back and forth. They get the information from the dragon that they were looking for, and the plot kind of moves forward and the dragon flies off. So the threat of Gambit blowing up that eye was enough for them to tame this dragon and get the information they needed. Okay, I'll buy it. I just wish getting to that point was a little clearer. And then, does he hold on to the eyeball here, or what's going on? Then Rogue and Gambit have this moment where you understand their relationship. And we know from past X-Men stories that Gambit and Rogue have a very intimate relationship. And so this is great. This is great that it communicates that and tells maybe a new reader that they're together. It's a really cute little detail here. I don't know if you guys can see it. A little heart here between the two of them. That's cute. The funny thing is, in the dialogue, Rogue says right here, better turn away, Logan, or don't, your call, because she's basically saying, if you want to look, you can look, but just warning you. And then in this panel, Logan he doesn't turn around, so that's kind of weird. And two, he's talking about his burnt bike, and he's not looking at it at all. So I feel like that could have been easily solved with Logan facing the bike, you know, like here's the bike. Here, busted up bike, and Logan could have been facing it, looking at it, while Rogue and Gambit are having their moment back here. Right? So he could be talking about the bike. He does turn around because he doesn't want to see their connection, and it all works together. But for some odd reason, they made him face this way where he's looking at nothing, and Rogue and Gambit aren't even doing anything. They're not even kissing. They're just kind of hanging out. Oh, I'm just going to put my arm around you, Rogue. That's really racy. And then Wolverine's talking about his bike, but looking over here. So another storytelling disconnect for me. So then they start on their journey, and Rogue gets a call from Scott, Cyclops, who is in Alaska. They're setting this up, not the Uncanny X-Men book, but just the plain X-Men book. They're kind of setting up Scott's story and what he's doing in Alaska. So that's a nice tie-in, and, you know, already assuming that those worlds are going to merge because this is all under the same banner of this new relaunch. Then we get this moment in Oregon where we see a girl running away and she's being followed by two shady characters. I feel like they're almost not abstracted enough to be threatening. They just feel like a couple guys coming out of a Ren fair out of the forest, which doesn't seem very threatening. I feel like the staging of this, they could be a lot more mysterious or threatening. The lighting could have been a lot more dramatic here because you're setting her up that she's running away and frightened. And so these guys got to be very, very threatening to build on that. And then this is the first time that it's revealed that she's a mutant. So they hit her with this lightsaber stick or whatever that triggers her mutant powers to kind of kick in. She has this power to transform into a deer. They have here a line of dialogue, "Oh dear, you're a bit hideous to look at," which I'm pretty sure was intentional. Rim shot. And then she uses her legs to kick him away, her antlers to stab through this one guy, and she reveals that her name is Fawn. Something else is chasing her, some sort of dark force in the forest. I think without seeing like eyes, and I have no idea who this character is or what they're about, but without seeing any kind of eyes, it's a little less threatening, even though these hands are creepy. I feel like if we just had a couple eyes in there staring at her and it was staged in a way where we could see them, it would have been a little bit more scary, but that's just a small nitpick there. And then we have this moment at a hospital where Nightcrawler is there, and I'm assuming he's a priest or part of the chaplain at the hospital because Rogue says, "Wait, do I call you father?" Nightcrawler's backstory is that he was religious and he was Catholic, but I didn't know that he became a priest or was part of a hospital or chaplain. But it's nice. It's a nice connection, and it's congruent with what you think could happen to Kurt Nightcrawler in the future. This is a nice homage to the Dave Cockrum poster image for Giant Size X-Men right here. And then we have this kid who is suffering from, I'm assuming, some sort of cancer. He's in some sort of treatment at the hospital because he doesn't have his hair. And he's just excited to meet the X-Men. This is a very Chris Claremont kind of moment. It's a human moment. You see the heroes, the superheroes that we love in everyday clothing, not hiding exactly who they are, but at the same time, not being full on in costume, doing superhero things. I love that. I love this moment. It's really heartfelt. This kid just wants to meet Rogue, and he reaches out to touch her hand. For those of you who know, Rogue has her whole power is centered around touching people, and she absorbs their powers and knocks them out when she does. And so she's very cautious about who she touches and when she touches her. So this is a very intimate moment. And then the kid goes into some sort of trance, cardiac arrest, almost channeling something else. So he starts having a stroke. It's this very dramatic moment. The X-Men are ushered out of the room. And at that point, we find out as they're sitting in the waiting room, which is great. Like that, it's great that we stay with it. We're not just like gone on to the next point, and we stay in that moment here. And you find out that the kid died. And you have this really human moment where Rogue breaks down and they have to talk about comforting the parents and just how they're processing death. This kid who idolized them just died in front of them. How do they process that? It's very different for all the characters. Here we are. The story takes us to Louisiana, which is where Gambit is from, which is familiar setting, and it makes sense. Like they're trying to just make their way to where they're going, and they're relying on their own personal connections to get them there. So they stop at a friend of Gambit's to stay overnight, this guy here. This frame was I felt like could have been staged better, because the focus here is a couple things. Rogue and Wolverine are in the foreground, and so you would expect that it would be about them or some sort of dialogue they're having. But it's not. It's actually Gambit meeting his buddy here, and they have this very, very bright light. I guess a flashlight is shining, but it's this weird, like he's obstructed because of the bright light, his friend is. And there's this whole dialogue between Remy, Gambit, and his friend, but it's happening in the background. Gambit's facing the other direction, and there's this bright light in the way. So I almost feel like the camera should have been reversed, or the staging should have been different, where like you could have put the Jeep back here, and Rogue and Wolverine could have been here in the background, and Gambit should have been here more in the foreground, and his friend could have been coming up to Gambit here, and Gambit would have been saying like, "Hey, how's it going, buddy?" Rogue could have been having her dialogue lines here. This is her inner monologue happening. Remy has exchanges, "Hey, good to see you." And he's like, "I brought a couple stowaways." And then we go to this close-up shot of his friend. So that way we can clearly see this is Gambit. Here's his friend. We see his close-up here in this next panel. And then Rogue and Wolverine are there, but they're just in the background. So yeah, I felt like that could have benefited from a reverse shot. Then they have this moment around a campfire and just talking about what they're looking for, the past they're running away from, where they're going. It's a very human moment. Just great dialogue between the characters, just giving us, the reader, a pulse on where each one of these characters feel about where the story is going. Here, Rogue is talking about calling Kate, who is referencing to Kitty Pryde, aka Shadowcat. Again, a character we are all very familiar with. And she's rejecting Rogue a little bit, saying like, "I don't want to be a part of this." I know she's in a bar and she's saying she doesn't want to be an X-Men anymore, but I almost wish that Kitty or Kate was doing something where she was phasing through something. Just as a reader who's coming back into the X-Men, we see her doing that, using her power. It's like, oh yeah, that's Kitty Pryde, just to kind of hammer that home, as opposed to just a random Kate if you didn't know that was Kitty Pryde or you didn't connect the dots. So I kind of wish she phased through something in the bar to pick up something else, or was just showing her power in a subtle way here. Then we get introduced to the new characters, the setup of the new characters. The X-Men all get into like defensive position here. And then we get the last shot of 4 new characters, maybe 5 if you count the horse. 5 new characters that are going to, I'm guessing, catapult us into the next story moment. This is the money shot, and they've done this time and time again in X books. Anytime they introduce new characters, new mutant characters that had powers and costumes and designs, they would introduce them in a way that was so exciting and would make you want to pick up the next book. And they did it so well in the 80s and 90s, where I feel like even side characters and villain characters were like the coolest things when they were introduced. This page doesn't really do that for me. The poses are very static. This guy looks kind of half asleep, not frightened, not threatening, not excited to be there, really static. This guy is really static. Both of their expressions are similar. Their costumes are kind of boring. This girl has somewhat of an interesting sci-fi costume. She looks like Kitty Pryde a little bit, but even the way that her power is working here does not look exciting. She's pretty static. They're all kind of standing very similarly vertically in this, not very dynamic. This girl just looks like a horse trainer with her horse in a vest. That's it. So when I saw this, I was like, oh, like it kind of brought it down. We're talking about classic Wolverine, Rogue, Gambit in defensive positions. Who are they going to fight? And they see these guys. So it left me with a little bit of a like disappointment at the end of this book. I'm hoping that these characters in the next issue will be very interesting and make me want to learn more about them. But this page, I feel like, could have been way more dynamic, way more exciting than it was presented here. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up was this QR code. There's been a lot of talk about Marvel books showing or using QR codes at the very end to show like the last page. And I don't know if it has to do with copyright issues or just to get people to be more, to start collecting digital comics more. I don't know, but I did see this, wasn't too excited about it. The idea that you couldn't see the last page of a book and you had to use a QR code to see it digitally was not exciting to me at all. That's not what they're doing here. And I'll show you guys what this QR code does right now. So here's the page that pops up digitally when you scan in that QR code. It's not a final page like some people had said online. It's what they call a bonus scene. And it doesn't seem like it's really crucial to enjoying the comic, which is okay. I mean, it's better than it being like an important page that you needed for the book, because I feel like if you're paying for the physical book, you got to get all the story, all the artwork. Why do you have to go through this whole process of using a QR code, which I think is kind of clunky? But it's more like supplemental material, and it just shows, I guess, the impending conflict between Rogue's approach to what the future of the X-Men is and Cyclops' approach, which are two different things. And from my understanding, those two are going to collide. The focus on this book is more from Rogue's perspective, and what I can tell, the focus on X-Men, not Uncanny X-Men, but just the regular X-Men book, is on Cyclops' perspective. So yeah, I mean, it was cool. I hope that that's all they do with these QR codes and not make it a crucial part of the reading experience, because that would be not great, in my opinion. So on a scale to 1 to 5, for the category of story, including the writing, I will give this one a 4. I think Gail Simone did a great job of kind of steeping the feel of this world in all the things that I loved about Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men. It's usually the story and not the art that has been a barrier for me to get back into X-Men. So kudos to Gail Simone for really capturing a feel that drew me into the original X books. She sets up the stakes very high, so you know that the situations the characters are going through are serious, are life and death, really impact them deeply. And then she also gives moments that I love of the characters just having conversation about their internal struggle. So it's like equal time was spent between what they're dealing with externally and also what they are wrestling with and figuring out internally. It's a tough thing for her as the writer, because these are well-known characters with so much history. And I feel like she didn't bog down with all the like referencing of what has happened in the past and all these moments. And a lot of books, when they do a relaunch, have to re-explain everything, and it just gets really burdensome and you get bogged down with those details. She didn't do that at all. She kind of just gave hints of nostalgia, hints of familiarity, and you could track it as a new reader or a reader like myself who's coming back to this series. You could really track and feel the beats. So it felt like, it's going to sound kind of weird, but it felt like I was coming home to reading this book. For the second category of world or genre in a scale to 1 to 5, I'll give this a 3. There was nothing really groundbreaking with what they were doing, at least right now, with the world. It was pretty familiar, takes place in a time period that is kind of present day. So there was nothing that made me go, wow, this is so different. And I think that's okay. But I don't think that they're trying to necessarily reinvent the world. They're trying to bridge the gap, it feels like, between where we started and where they want to go. So yeah, I'll give it a 3. For characters on a scale to 1 to 5, I give this a 4. Gail Simone is working with characters that are very well known in the X worlds, right? So it's like Nightcrawler, Rogue, Gambit, Wolverine. These are all mainstay staples. And I feel like how she wrote them, their dialogue, their interaction with one another, their internal monologues was pretty close to what I feel like these characters would be saying and thinking. So again, it was like walking into a familiar space. It wasn't like, wait, Rogue wouldn't say that, or Wolverine wouldn't say that. It was very familiar. And it was not in the big action moments that I felt like that familiarity. It was more in the quiet moments, which Gail Simone did a great job in one issue of carving out some of those spaces. That's where you really got to get a sense of these characters and who they were. They felt very true to what Chris Claremont had established early on, down to the accent, the phrasing, very, very familiar. I will say that the new characters that were introduced weren't that interesting to me. A little anticlimactic of how they were introduced at the end. So we'll see. For art, I'd give this a 3. And it's not because David Marquez is not a great artist. He's really good and has some beautiful drawings, beautiful renderings, beautiful renditions and versions of characters that we know and love. I think there were some questions I had about the storytelling and his comic storytelling language, which got me confused a little bit, or I thought could be tightened up a little bit. So that's what brought that ranking for me a little bit down. I think he's a great artist. He definitely has a style that matches with a lot of the current X books that are out there right now and what is in the mainstream market. So I think that's great. It's just some of those storytelling moments that I highlighted in the flip through that I feel like could be improved upon. In summary, I'd say if there's one thing that makes me want to pick up the next issue in this series, it's the writing. And that's pretty surprising because normally it's the art that keeps me going on books that I'm still learning about or still figuring out. So I give all the props to Gail Simone. I feel like she did her research and knows these characters and is treating them with a lot of respect and was able to tap into that nostalgia of me as a kid and how much I love Uncanny X-Men. I'm not so sure about the new characters and where that'll go, but hopefully they will really lean on these mainstay characters that we do know to carry the series forward. And I hope that they show us different aspects of these characters that will just build on the X-Men universe. Who knows? We'll see. But I'm definitely in for issue 2. I think that's a win for them. Hopefully a win for me, and hopefully a win for you guys as well, as you think about, should I read X-Men? Should I read Uncanny X-Men? Is it worth me picking up? Especially for somebody who was such a big fan of the Chris Claremont run in the 80s and 90s. Well, hope you enjoyed that. Hope it was informative. If you could please like and subscribe, turn on notifications for my channel. I'm always putting out content that has to do with my love of comics, and I will see you guys next time for another episode of Closer Look.